All right, it seems like we are live. I'm just going to do a little check here on the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page to verify that we're live and ready to go. A good morning to anyone who is watching this. I hope everyone is having a good start to your Wednesday. So it does look like we are live and we're ready to go. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I am the Communication Specialist for UA Museums. And joining me for a discussion about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail is Director of the Office of Archaeological Research, Matt Gage. How are you doing today, Matt?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Doing pretty well. So I'm excited to talk about the Indigenous Mound Trail because I've heard a lot about it. I've seen some pictures and some videos, so I'm excited to learn more about it.
Great. I'm excited too. I got my t-shirt on. I don't know if you can see that or not.
No, it looks awesome. I'm gonna have to get me one of those t-shirts. I'll have to
That's right.
I'll have to get some merch. That's awesome. Well,
we're getting casual down here with this COVID-19 thing and everybody working from home. So
well, it looks great. T-shirt looks great. It's a great logo, and you're really pulling that look off. So I appreciate it.
Brian Rushing, my partner in crime on this, has managed to put these t-shirts together. So all
awesome.
the accolades go to Brian.
Well, I will definitely have to get me one of those t-shirts. Well, while we are broadcasting, feel free to ask Matt any questions in the comment section. And as a reminder, this is all live, so anything can happen during this broadcast. We hope it goes smoothly, but sometimes with internet connections these days, you might just have to be patient with us. So just hang in there with us in case Facebook has any issues or we have any issues. Everybody, especially websites like Facebook, are trying their best to meet the needs of online activity during this time. Well, now that we've gotten all that out of the way, Matt, so what do you want to tell us about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail?
So we're going to make this a two-part segment where we're going to be talking about the Mound Trail and why we're doing the Mound Trail, the history behind it, and some of the most significant sites here in the state of Alabama that hopefully once all of this is over with, folks can go travel to and visit. So we're excited about it. We've been working on it for a number of years, and we've got some fantastic partners. The University Center for Economic Development, a huge factor in putting all this together. The Bicentennial Commission has been fantastic. The Alabama Historical Commission has been fantastic. And we've got a number of other partners that have helped us through all of this who have just been absolutely great. The folks that deserve a huge amount of credit for this are the indigenous peoples, both here in Alabama and folks that have been removed out to Oklahoma. They provided a lot of information on this and really helped us to get things together.
That's awesome. Yeah, it seems like a big effort went into this, and I think it's a really awesome project. So where should we start when we talk about it?
All right. Well, we're going to begin the process by talking about some of the definitions that we use in this. You're going to have to be able to have a little bit of familiarity to follow along with some of what we're talking about. And we've got a range of folks watching, hopefully, and to get everybody kind of on the same page, I wanted to talk about a few things. When we talk about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail, we're talking about a whole series of different types of monumental architecture. And when we talk about monumental architecture, we're talking about large features that are scattered across our landscape, and they mean different things to different people. If you look at our monumental architecture from the past 200 years, for instance, you can think of things like the Statue of Liberty, the Washington Monument, Mount Rushmore, other things that, have so much meaning to people when they see them, and they have a complete understanding, or maybe not a complete understanding, but they have a cultural understanding of what those things mean. It's the same with the monumental architecture that existed before European contact. And the people that were here, they didn't just roam around in the forest. They lived in cities and towns and communities that had incredible cultural influence over each other. They shared ideas, they traded, they had incredible economies that spread over huge areas. So we really want to highlight those things that a lot of people here in Alabama just aren't familiar with. They haven't had a chance to talk with too many Native Americans and really understand the depth of culture that existed before European contact. So, monumental architecture. In Alabama, we have several different types of monumental architecture. We have earthen architecture. Typically, when you think about a typical earthen feature, you're talking about the mounds like here at Moundville. You want to go ahead and flip to the next slide, Rebecca?
Yeah, sure can.
There we go. So here's a picture of the mounds here at Moundville. And, you know, some of them are large, some of them are relatively small. We have mounds in the state of Alabama that range in size from about 5 feet in diameter and 2 feet high, all the way up to Mound B here at the park, which is the largest mound in Alabama that's over 70 feet tall. So these earthen structures are incredibly varied. Some are flat top, some are rounded, some are conical. So there's all different shapes and sizes of these mounds, and that's just one type. We also have sand mounds, which are very particular to the Gulf Coast region. Gulf State Park, for instance, has a sand mound right in the picnic area down there, and a lot of folks don't even know that. Then we also have a lot of shell mounds in Alabama, and some of those shell mounds are massive. And when I say massive, I mean they're a couple 100 yards long, and some of them are up to 8 yards tall. But over the years, they've become obscured, and a lot of folks don't realize how big these things are. And they're not just trash piles where people threw out shell. A lot of these are intentionally constructed mounds that have a lot of meaning to the people that built them.
So, just ask a question. Ask a question. So, when you say shell mound, what does that mean? It has shells in it?
So the majority of the mound is comprised of shells, and that may be a single type of shell, or it may be multiple kinds of shell. When you get down on the Gulf Coast, we have shell mounds that are made out of a combination of everything from rangia and oyster to shells. When you get up into North Alabama, you have shells that may be made out of a combination of, for common terms, periwinkle and heel splitter mussels. These things are incredibly varied as well. And then the last type of mound that I want to mention are stone mounds. And stone mounds are incredibly common across the state of Alabama, particularly the northern half of the state and in the Piedmont region. Harry Holstein up at Jacksonville State has been working for a number of years documenting stone mounds on the Piedmont. And years ago, we did quite a bit of work on stone mounds up in the Franklin County area. And stone mounds are also incredibly varied. Some of them have earth in them, and they're just kind of covered over with stones. And others are comprised almost exclusively of stones. Some of the places that we've been working, like over in the Piedmont area, some of those mounds were built from burden stones, where members of the community celebrated an individual or remembered family members by carrying a stone up a mountain and placing it on the mound. And that's a pretty unique tradition. So that's what we're talking about when we say monumental architecture. And some of these, again, are massive, and some of them are relatively small. But the variability in monumental architecture in Alabama is absolutely incredible. And there's a reason that people built them in the way that they built them. Everything has meaning behind it. Now, another common misconception is that all of these mounds are burial mounds, and they're not. A lot of them do have human remains in them. A lot of them are intentional burial mounds, but not all of them. And when you consider the depth of time involved with all of these mounds and how long people have been building them, you see that over time there's almost an evolution of mounds and how they were used. So we know that some of the earliest mounds were built at the end of the early Archaic, roughly about 8,900 years ago. When folks started building big shell mounds, you start to see those on the Tennessee River. all the way up into Tennessee and across northern Alabama. But shell mounds continued to be built all the way up until European contact. And then we see earthen mounds really starting to be built right around the end of the late Archaic, about 5,500 years ago. And those tended to, the first of those that we have in the southeast come from northeastern Louisiana and northwestern Mississippi. And then we've just recently, in the past several years, found that we have a late Archaic mound up in the Tennessee Valley. And those mounds are very unique. Some of them have intentionally constructed forms to them that included things like sand or clays that were brought in from different locations. And to convince people that it is a good idea to pile up earth in the southeast takes a lot of convincing, if you ask me. You think about building a pile of dirt in Alabama, it's most likely not going to last very long. You know, you the first rainstorm that comes along, you're going to end up with soil being washed away.
Yeah.
And you would think that there would be very few of these mounds left, but there's an incredible number. If you can go to that PowerPoint,
Sure.
go to the next slide.
All right.
I think you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. So we've got, I hope everybody can see that at home. We've got almost 30,000 archaeological sites recorded in Alabama. And many sites include mounds. And there aren't 30,000 mounds, but there are a lot of them. And those mounds still exist today. And for them to still exist today, we know that there had to be some incredible engineering involved in them. There was a study done of some of the mounds up at Shiloh by a geoarchaeologist named Sarah Sherwood. And she found that when they were building these, we knew that they were building them one basket load at a time. So you'd go over to a certain location and you'd fill up a basket with earth. You'd carry it over to wherever you wanted your mound to be built and you'd dump it. But again, when we talk about something like that in Alabama in the summertime, the first rainstorm is going to flatten it out.
Yeah.
Turn it into a muddy mess. So these people had engineers that knew how to place sod blocks and build retaining walls and other things that would help hold the soil in place for long periods of time. We also know that some of these mounds had pooled clay surfaces, or what's been referred to as clay mantles, spread over the mounds to help make them almost impervious to the penetration of water. So you have different colored clays used in a lot of instances. When we get into the woodland, for instance, we know that the Capena culture, they really enjoyed using red clays. And some of those mounds would have been bright orangish red and visible from a long way off. We know that we've seen that in several locations where they intentionally selected the earth for the brightness. Here at Moundville, we know that some of the mounds probably had almost like that a clay finish on them, where they were a certain color. We've seen pooled clay that's purple, white, yellow, gray, almost a pink color. And we know that all of that was intentional in the design. So these people knew what they were doing when it came to building these mounds. They had a very specific idea of the aesthetics that they were seeking. And they did a very intentional job of building the majority of these. So, let's get back to our discussion of burial versus non-burial mounds. By the woodland period, we see the construction of a lot of mounds that are typically identified as burial mounds. And those are mounds that are specifically built for burying individuals. I mentioned the Capena a second ago. The Capena, the name actually refers to copper and galena, which is a common artifact that was found in association with these burial mounds. A lot of times they would dig a burial pit, they would place an individual in it, and then they would build a mound over the top of the individual. So We have burial mounds that are made out of earth, like those for Kapina, and we have burial mounds that are made from stone. Not all stone piles are burial mounds, but some of them are, and being able to differentiate between them is very difficult. Then we also have residential mounds. So here at Moundville, for instance, we have a lot of flat-topped, large pyramidal structures or pyramidal mounds that had structures on top of them. And those structures, in some instances, are massive. We've got some here that had central support posts that indicate the structures were probably 25 or 30 feet high on the interior and were incredibly large just in terms of the area that they covered. We know from some sites in other parts of the Southeast that these structures could be massive. If you go to Florida and look at some of the buildings that have been put up down there to replicate these types of structures, they're incredibly huge. You could fit hundreds of people inside them. And in fact, if you read DeSoto Chronicles, it talks about what it was like to see some of the architecture that the Native American communities were putting together. It talks about some buildings that were large enough that they could put 1,000 people inside of them.
Wow.
So, we're not talking about small little huts in some instances. In particular, a lot of the structures that are built on top of these mounds are very large. They also would have been very intricate. In DeSoto Chronicles, they talk about the interior of some of these structures. And, they mention that the walls are lined with strings of pearls, and there's beautifully carved boxes inside lining the walls that hold the remains of their ancestors. They talk about huge carvings that are standing at the entranceways to these. They talk about the posts on the interior being carved. They talk about all different aspects of art and architecture that are associated with these buildings that would just, have been incredible to see. And unfortunately, the vast majority of those carvings were made on perishable materials, and in our southeastern climate, they deteriorated relatively rapidly, and we don't have the opportunity to see a lot of that. But we do know that some of the Native American carvings that have been recovered in various wetland environments show incredibly intricate features like zoomorphs, which refers to carvings that look like animals in various forms, and anthropomorphs, which refers to carvings that were made to look like people. So it's pretty amazing.
So can you determine the structures by archaeology, or are you having to look back into history and see how it was documented in like a written form? I guess my question is, like, as an archaeologist, can you determine if there was a structure built by what you see in the mound?
Yes, you can tell if there was a structure by what you see in the mound. The architectural style, particularly during the Mississippian, was very unique. It involved either single set posts or wall trenches that would have been excavated into the summit, and the posts either set in the trench or put into these individual post holes. And then there would have been wattle that would have been woven between the posts. So basically taking branches and weaving the branches in between the posts to create a wall. And then taking mud and putting it on the outside to make almost a stucco. We know, again, from various ethnographic reports from early on when the first Europeans arrived and reported what they saw, that a lot of these had matting hanging on the interior of the walls. So it wasn't like you were looking at a rough surface. You were looking at a finished mat, probably woven reed mat hanging on the walls on the interior. The floors would have been covered by such matting. And we find those archaeologically as well. When these structures had served their purpose, a lot of times they would burn them to the ground and then build a new stage of the mound on top of them, and then a new structure on top of that. And what we see is a lot of the carbonized remains, and when the daub, the mud that was smeared on the outside of the huts, is fired, it creates almost a rock hard fired clay that is referred to as daub, and it maintains the impressions of both the wattle and the posts on the interior of these pieces of clay. So we know from the archaeology that these structures were there. And we know from the ethnographic accounts, the early reports of folks, that there were a incredible number of structures and an incredible variability in the structures. Again, talking about buildings that housed 1,000 people down to individual huts that families would have lived in. So there's an individual in the anthropology department, Cameron Lackermont, who did his, I believe it was his master's thesis on a project here at Moundville where he actually built a hut from scratch, and then he burned it to see what type of evidence would be left behind. And it was really interesting. It helped show through experimental archaeology the process of not only building, but also what a structure would look like after it was burned and entered into the archaeological record. So that was a great research project that he did, and it really helped us to understand the architecture here at Moundville in particular. Now, we talked about the buildings on top of mounds, but we didn't really get into how the mounds themselves are how they're formed over long periods of time. Most of these mounds at Moundville were not built at one time. They were built over a relatively short period of time. When I say relatively, I mean over about a 200-year period. All of the mounds at Moundville were built. And they weren't all built at one time. They're built in stages. So what would happen was a group would come together and they would build the initial stage of a mound, and they might build a structure on top of it. And if you think about living in Alabama without pest control and without, for lack of a better way to say it, indoor plumbing and restroom facilities, you run the risk of getting quite a bit of vermin and other things inside the house and on the edges of the mound where people are having to use the restroom. And what happens is you have an environment that's relatively contaminated, and the easiest way to decontaminate it is to start it on fire and burn it to the ground, and then cover it with a new stage of construction. Piling earth on top of it, and then building a brand new structure on top of that. Now, we know that people weren't just burning these places to the ground every time there was a problem with it. A lot of repairs are evidenced by additional post holes that are placed in these structures. We see that archaeologically. We know that people would, if there was a problem with one of the walls, they could fix it. If there was a post that rotted, they could replace it. If they needed an additional bit of area on the interior of their house, they could expand it. So just like today, when people do renovations on homes, they did the exact same thing back then. But again, when we get back to the Alabama environment and lack of pest control, it's going to end up getting to a point where you're going to have to do something about the number of critters living in the walls of your home. And one of the easiest ways to deal with it is just to burn it to the ground and start fresh.
Yeah.
So what we see archaeologically is that these mounds are built in stages. There's levels, and not all of the construction is equal. Sometimes they may have a year where they just add a little bit of material to a mound, and sometimes they may have a year where they add a massive addition to a mound. And sometimes one side of the mound is higher than the other, and other times the mounds are built up to be completely level. So again, there's just a lot of variability in these earthen mounds. One other thing that I want to talk about as we're kind of getting through all of this is cultural bias and how we see things when we're looking at these sites. A lot of people see mounds in Alabama as just sort of interesting piles of dirt. representative of a long gone culture that is no longer around. And that's just not the case. When we look at things, um, we can't get away from the fact that we have cultural bias. We come from a place that has a lot. We come from a society that sees things in certain ways and believes certain things, and that influences how we see the world around us. And the way that we see it may not be the exact same as the way other cultures see it. And we have to really appreciate that. And those cultures aren't gone, they're still around, both here in Alabama and out in Oklahoma with the removed tribes. They still practice a lot of the things that the people that built Moundville, that built all of these mounds, practiced back hundreds or thousands of years ago. And those cultural traditions that they carry on, a lot of them are incredibly foreign to us that aren't familiar with Native American practices and Native American cultures. And it's really good for us to get an opportunity to learn about those cultures and to interact with those people, because it helps us to learn so much more about who we are and how we became who we became. Alabama is incredibly lucky in the sense that we have just an absolute amazing amount of cultural heritage. And we want people to take advantage of that. We want them to take advantage of it respectfully and help us to protect these things by not digging and not going out and picking up artifacts willy-nilly. But we also want people to take advantage of what's here and to learn about these things. And we actually have a web page for the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail.
I can pull that up real quick. We actually got a question while we're talking about the website. Stephen asks, "Can we see a map of the Mound Trail? Is that on the website?" Let's see.
It certainly is.
I will try to pull that up. And let me get that question off. Sorry, this takes a little bit of finagling. All right, so I'm going to pull this up here. See if we can get this to go full screen. Let's see, hang on. Yeah, so that should help. So where on the, is there a map on the website?
There is. I'm not exactly sure where it is because I'm not on the map on the website myself right now.
Okay, I will, as you talk, I'll try to see if I can find it.
Okay. If you go to find a location at the top of the webpage, so that has a list of all of the current Mound Trail sites. Right now, there are 13 of them, and we're hoping to soon add a 14th. But if you scroll all the way to the bottom of that page, you'll see a Google map that has the locations of them. And you can actually click on each of the pins that are on there, and it'll give you a little bit of history of what the mounds are.
Yeah, it shows you each location and tells you a little something about them. That's really awesome.
So what we wanted to do was to try to include mounds that are scattered across our state, not just one mound in the middle or two mounds up in the Tennessee Valley. We really wanted everybody across the state to have an opportunity. Now you'll notice if you're looking at the map, there's sort of a gap in the southeastern region. And that's because when we select these sites, we want to make sure that there are facilities in place to assist visitors and to help protect the mounds. So we're not just going to show the location of every single mound across the state of Alabama. What we're showing is either the location of mounds that exist today that have park facilities, or in the instance of two of the sites, the signage and other things that are associated with the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail are actually at locations away from the mounds, because the mounds have either been completely excavated, like the Coker Ford Mound up in Weiss Basin, or they have been destroyed by some type of development like railroad tracks. When you build a railroad bed, you need to have a lot of material, and one of the easiest places to find that material seemed to have been earthen mounds. They would dig up the mounds and move the material over to make the railroad bed, and we see that at a lot of places. Um, Bessemer Mounds and the mound at Old Cahaba are two mounds that were partially destroyed as a result of construction of railroad or utility lines. So again, if you look at that map, you'll see that they're sort of scattered all over the state. We're hoping that the 14th mound that we're going to add will be down in southeast Alabama at a Mussey Creek Mounds. That had been a park that was established several years ago with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and some folks from down in Columbia, Alabama. But the park itself has deteriorated, and we're going to have to get in there and do some clearing and some upkeep and upgrade to it, and make sure that it's set up to help to preserve these mounds and not just let anybody get in there any time of day that they want. So again, our idea is that we've got to be good stewards of these mounds, and we've got to help protect them. So let's see. What else did I have that I wanted to make sure that we talked about before we get started? I mentioned a little bit about the tribes that have been removed. On our webpage, there are links to a lot of these tribes. I don't know if you can bring that back up, Rebecca.
Yeah, I can.
At the top right, it has tribal websites. If folks haven't looking at these tribal websites, I would recommend that you do it, because there's a lot of incredible information on those websites, and a lot of these folks are very excited for non-Native Americans to learn about who they are and their culture and where they're from and why they are out in Oklahoma. A lot of folks don't know about the Indian Removal Act that occurred in 1830, which basically forced all of the Native Americans east of the Mississippi to relocate out to Oklahoma. There were a lot of folks that were able to hide out and avoid being removed. There were folks that had assimilated into the cultures of the time that were lucky enough to avoid being removed. But in a lot of those instances, they had to hide their culture. They couldn't continue to practice the types of things that they had before Europeans arrived. And as many folks know, when Europeans did arrive, they brought with them diseases that native populations didn't necessarily have the ability to combat. Just kind of like with COVID-19 right now, they were new viruses and diseases that they'd never experienced before, and their bodies, they just had no immunity to it. So things like smallpox and chickenpox had an incredible toll on the populations that were here. And when I say an incredible toll, there's estimates of 75 to 90% of the Native American population having been wiped out by these diseases. So that's an incredible number of people that are lost, and an incredible amount of information and cultural tradition that gets lost. I talk to folks a lot about what that means. So to give you kind of an idea of what that would look like, we talk about COVID-19 and how bad it is right now. I think the mortality rate, or the rate for folks dying, is, what is it now, Rebecca? Is it about 3% right now?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the latest number is.
But compare that to 75 to 90%.
Yeah, that's a lot.
We'll give you something to kind of relate to. Say you are in a family of 4, and you're a 12-year-old kid, and all of your other 3 family members get sick. You try to help them as best you can, but they don't make it and they die. So you're 12 years old. You've experienced, we'll say, you've experienced a number of holidays that you're familiar with, say the 4th of July and Christmas, for instance. You know what those holidays are about. They're about, one's about the celebration of the founding of our country, and another is about the celebration of the birth of Jesus and Santa Claus and other things. But you may not know all of the factors that are involved in that. You may not understand why you bring a Christmas tree into the house. You may not understand why you shoot off fireworks. You may not understand what every aspect of the flag means. And all of that history that some of those other members of your family understood and carried with them is lost when they go. And what happens is traditions and beliefs end up getting changed. And that's something that affected Native American cultures incredibly. Now, they were able to retain an incredible amount of their traditions and traditional belief systems. But a lot of it was affected by such a massive loss of population. So, all right. Rebecca, have you got any questions before we move on?
No, I think that's really awesome to see the different websites. I would encourage everybody to go and check out the tribal websites and learn a little bit more about each of them. I definitely need to do that myself. So that's really cool that you all have that on the Mound Trail website.
Yeah, and we've had such great involvement with various tribes like the Abika over at Choccolocco Archaeological District. They've been just absolutely fantastic, providing information about what was there and how the sites in that area came to be, and their oral traditions tie in so well. Such tight knit stories that fit in with the archaeological record in that area. It's amazing. And over in that area, there's actually some really incredible monumental architecture, including a stone bird effigy that we don't have it on the Mound Trail, but that's another one that we'd love to see get added. It's part of a park up on top of the Piedmont, and it's really, really an incredible feature. So, Rebecca, as I'm going through some of this, and if you hear me say some words that you think folks might want to know a little bit more about, please interrupt me and just let me know.
Yeah, I will definitely ask you questions I don't understand or I need more information.
Yeah. All right, so what I wanted to do now is just kind of go through a couple of the mound sites, and we'll go through a few today, and then the next time we get together, we'll go through some more of these. So we're going to start with that PowerPoint presentation that I sent you, Rebecca.
Okay.
The larger of the two.
Let's see, am I on the right one?
Keep on going. It's going to be not that one, but the other one.
Oh, okay. Let me pull the other one up. Let's see.
That right there is one of the earliest mounds that we know of in Alabama. The graphic that she just showed was a pooled red clay mound that dates to the late Archaic. That's up in the Huntsville area. All right, so here we are. I'm not sure if everybody can see that on their computer screen. I'm using my telephone, so I can't see it at all, but I've got a cheat sheet here in front of me that's going to help me. We're going to just go through a couple of these, talk about the sites themselves, where they're located, and give people an idea of what's there. So the first one that we're going to look at is the Florence Indian Mound, and if you want to jump to the next screen.
It should be coming up. Yeah.
That name kind of ruins the surprise of where it's located. If anybody has been up to Florence, if you're heading from south to north up Highway 43, and you have to cross over the bridge right there adjacent, crossing over the Tennessee River right there adjacent to Mcfarland Park, Mcfarland Park is going to be on the west side of the highway, and on the east side of the highway, you'll notice that there's kind of a rise in the trees right down on the floodplain of the Tennessee River. And that rise is one of the largest woodland mounds in Alabama. The Florence Mounds is a big structure that was built about 8,100 or in between 8,100 and 500. And then we know that later on, some Mississippian folks took advantage of the summit and used it as well. But the mound was originally investigated back in 1848 when two individuals were looking around the southeast trying to find some of these Native American mounds and try to get a better understanding of them. Because in the early 1800s to late 1800s, there was a strong push to say that Native Americans couldn't have been responsible for building these massive architectural features. And the idea was these people just didn't have the knowledge. When you asked them whether or not these mounds were built by their ancestors, a lot of them said no. They knew that they were built a long time ago, but they didn't know by who. And if we think back to what we just discussed about those populations being decimated by diseases, that's not surprising that those oral traditions and the histories of a lot of these places were lost. But another thing that we don't often consider is population movement. And often, in many cases, the people that built these mounds weren't the same people that were there when Europeans arrived. Just like today, populations moved around the landscape, and that may have been because they wanted to find a richer environment to raise their family in. It may have been because they were dealing with conflict with adjacent tribes. It could have been because of any number of reasons. But what we see is, in a lot of instances, the folks that built the mounds weren't the same people that were living there when the first Europeans encountered them. So when Squire and Davis went out, what they were trying to determine was who built these mounds. And at the time, there was a big push, particularly by the Mormon Church, to say that Mormons were responsible for the construction of these mounds, or that it was a lost tribe of Israelites who were responsible for the construction of these mounds, and that it had nothing to do with Native Americans, except for the fact that the Native Americans had wiped out this lost tribe and killed them all and had taken over the lands. Well, Squire and Davis went around and they looked at a lot of these mounds. And then later on, there were additional individuals that went around and did the same thing. Cyrus Thomas, for instance, trying to determine who was responsible for building the mounds. And when they started looking at the ceramics, when they started looking at a lot of the iconography that they were finding on materials from these mounds, they realized that unequivocally it was Native Americans that had been building them. So again, one of these sites that Squire and Davis went to visit was this site up in Florence. And if you look at the map that's right there in the top right-hand corner of the slide, you can see there's the Tennessee River flowing by with Cane Island out in front of it. And then it shows a large mound in the middle with that big arc around it. And that arc is remnants of a embankment that would likely have been part of a palisade wall. And when I say palisade, I'm referring to a wall that's built out of posts that would have created a semicircular protective barrier around that mound. And in some instances, these palisades are very big. They would have been somewhere in the ballpark of 12 to 16 feet tall, so very difficult for people to scale if they were trying to attack that location. A lot of times they were built kind of the way that I mentioned the structures were built, with single set posts or wall trenches. The posts set in the trenches or the post holes, and then they would have wattle woven in between and mud or daub packed on top. So it would have created a very solid very tall wall. Here at Moundville, we know that the palisade that surrounded Moundville had bastions, and those bastions were places where guards could get up onto platforms at the top of the wall, and if somebody was attacking, they could shoot with crossing fire with bows and arrows to ensure that they wouldn't be able to breach the wall. So when Squire and Davis went and looked at this mound, they found that earthen embankment that surrounded it. And those protective palisades or embankments are relatively common at mound sites in the Southeast, particularly during the Mississippian. We know that in some instances, those palisade walls were accompanied by ditches. So you've got a big, tall wall on one side, but to get to the bottom of it, you've got to go down into a ditch, which makes that wall even higher. And when we think about moats and protective walls, it brings to mind a lot of castles in European cities that have big, wide moats and drawbridges and other things. These people would have had relatively similar engineering features in place. There probably would have been some bridges that could be pulled up that cross these moats. In most instances, the moats weren't filled with water, but in some instances, we know that they were. And they probably wouldn't have held water year round, but they definitely would have held it during the rainy season. It's more of an effort to try to make the walls even more difficult to climb over by having those ditches on the outside, and it definitely slows down attackers.
Do we know, Matt, why were they concerned about building walls? Were they trying to keep animals out or other people? Is that something that we even know?
We do know that there was a lot of warfare during this time period. Groups that were raiding one another, groups that were stealing people for slavery, people that were attacking to try to steal resources. We know that a lot of folks were in conflict at that time. And again, we know from the ethnographic documents, again, I refer to DeSoto Chronicles, that there were polities or groups that were allied with each other. And they may have multiple mound complexes where they have one central mound complex that's sort of the location of the preeminent leaders. And all of those other mound complexes pay tribute. But then when somebody in that polity is attacked, they all come together to help protect them from other polities that might be attacking them. So if we think about it in terms of our own history, it could be a situation like Europe where the Allies banded together to fight against the Axis during World War II. It would have been the same scenario here where different groups banded together to protect each other, but each one of their cities would have had its own protective structures in place. And we really see palisades and protective features like this start to occur in the late woodlands and then progress through the Mississippian. And if you think about it in terms of population density and what's happening at that time, these people, are beginning to get into agriculture, and they're subsisting very heavily on agriculture. So you have grain stores, you have corn stores, you have other resources that you're stockpiling to help get your community through the winter or through the lean months. And in some instances, those other groups may not have had such a good season, and they may need to attack you to get some resources to help their own communities survive the winter. And we know that a lot of this conflict comes from things like that, where one group is attacking another group, trying to get resources. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you.
All right. So today there's the Florence Indian Mound Museum is a fantastic place. It's situated right at the base of the mound. Brian Murphy's a director up there. He's a great guy. If you get an opportunity to go up and talk with him or some of his staff, It's a really neat museum to go look at. There's a set of stairs that you can climb to get to the summit of the mound, and it's a beautiful structure. Now, unfortunately, there's been a lot of industrial development in that area that has affected the surrounding area. So the embankment that we see in Squire and Davis's map no longer exists, and that area is partially covered up by a port facility that's right there, used by the city of Florence and by several industries that are located at the site. But the museum is fantastic. It's a really neat place. They've got a section that talks about the prehistory of Alabama from Paleo-Indian all the way up through European contact, and it's got discussion of the construction of the mound, and it's kind of neat because it's like you're walking into a cave or a grotto, the way it's built. So if you get a chance, go take a look at it. It's an incredible place. All right.
Is there before you go on, is there a recommended starting point for the mound trail? Is this the top of the mount? Like, are we going to go from north to south? Is that
Nope, we're going to bounce all over the place. And the
okay?
idea is, folks, Alabama's a big state, and it's very difficult for folks to consider doing a trip like this all at once. So what we want is for folks to be able to, start out by going to the mounds in their communities and close by to where they live, so they have an opportunity to learn a little bit about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail, to learn a little bit about what mounds are, and to get a better appreciation for the cultural heritage in their area. And then we want them to start spreading out across the state. And I mentioned this earlier, Rebecca. A fantastic way to do this is to combine the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail with the Alabama Barbecue Trail, and taking advantage of both of them at the same time.
That's a great idea.
I'm hoping a lot of our viewers are fans of barbecue, because I know I can't live without it for a few days. So, well, let's move on. We're probably only going to have time for one more mound.
Okay, let's see.
And then we're going to have to call it quits. And this next one is going to be one of our most complicated ones. This is at the opposite end of the state. This is down at Gulf State Park. And Gulf State Park is a really, really interesting place. Everybody thinks of Gulf State Park in terms of the beaches and getting a chance to go down and swim in the ocean and maybe go fishing to get a tan, whatever it may be. But in terms of cultural heritage, it's an absolutely incredible place as well. There are sand mounds at Gulf State Park. There are shell mounds at Gulf State Park. There are Indian canals at Gulf State Park. And they have done a really good job with the recent renovations of the park of getting a lot of new signage out there that folks can take advantage of and learn about what's in the park. A couple years back, we had a museum expedition that did some work on one of the shell mounds down there on the edge of Lake Shelby. And the park, that portion of Gulf State Park, is the picnic area. I'm not sure if many folks remember the zip line that was down there, or there's some, you can take a canoe out into the lake that's right there. There's a problem with alligators because they're everywhere out there. You got to be careful. But this is Alabama, and we've got to take advantage of the opportunities to see wildlife wherever we can. But our excavations down there showed us that there is just an absolutely incredible culture along the edge of Lake Shelby. Right there at the picnic area, the shell mound in places is well over 1 meter thick. And we know that the sand mound that's there, we've got an individual who's working in the area right now. We know that dates to the end of the woodland, and then continues to be used all the way through the Mississippi and right up until European contact. There's a Pensacola phase occupation of the park area that took advantage of both the shell mound and the sand mound. But the majority of those architectural features were built during the woodland, long before Mississippian folks came into the picture. So It's really a neat spot. And right now, the University of South Alabama is doing some work on one of the canals that's down there. If you consider how transport was conducted back at that time, they didn't have horses, they didn't have pack mules, they didn't use wagons. The majority of if it wasn't a person that was moving materials around, it was going to be a travois or a pack attached to a dog. But we don't have horses until after European contact in North America. So the majority of transport is either going to be done by people carrying packs and walking trails, or it's going to be done by canoe. And down there, this canal system is fantastic because it would have provided people an opportunity to be in a canoe and traverse much of the Gulf Coast, probably all the way from Wolf Bay, if not all the way over to Apalachicola, to get all the way to Mobile Bay without ever having to go out into the open ocean. And if you think about how difficult it is for modern boats to travel around out in the open ocean, imagine what it would have been like to have been in a dugout canoe trying to transport 50 pots from, say, Apalachicola all the way up to Mobile. It would not have been an easy journey unless you were able to navigate through these inland waterways that kept you kind of protected from storms and high seas. So these engineers were pretty amazing in the work that they did. And again, the University of South Alabama right now is doing a really neat project associated with that. So the Alabama Archaeological Society winter meeting, we had Greg Wazelkoff present about those canals, and it was incredibly interesting. If folks are interested, go check out their webpage, and you'll get an opportunity to learn a little bit more about those canals. But I think, Rebecca, that's probably about all the time that we've got. Is there any more questions?
Well, I have a question just really quickly. So we have the earthen mounds and then the shell mounds and sand mounds. Were either of them sturdier, or did one work better than the other, or did they just have to work with what they had in their location?
Well, it's a combination of things. Sand and earth, I mentioned the different colored clays that were used, and shell all have meaning to people. So it isn't just based on the resources that they have available. In fact, we know that in some instances they're probably transporting earth from specific locations tens, if not hundreds of miles for the specific purpose of building using those materials. So you do see more sand mounds along the Gulf Coast where you've got a lot more sand. You do see a lot more shell mounds in places where you've got shell available, like along the rivers of Alabama or along the Gulf Coast. And you see a lot more stone mounds in places that have stone available. But again, they had intent when they were building these. They often carried these soils incredible distances, soil, sands, or shell, or stone, incredible distances to make these mounds in a specific way.
Yeah, it's really incredible to think that even back in 150 AD 150, they were doing these incredible architectural feats. Sometimes I think that in our present day we're so smart, we have all these technological advancements and all of that, but those people back then were doing amazing things. Even with their limited technology, they figured it out. They had problems and they solved them. So I think that's awesome.
And what archaeologists wouldn't give to be able to go back in time and see these activities occurring. Watch a group of folks building one of these mounds and how they dealt with rainstorms and why they chose specific colors for the soils or the clays. When they built the structures on top, how long did it take before it made sense to burn it to the ground and build a new one? So, there's all kinds of reasons for doing this. And archaeology is fantastic. We learn so much about the different stories that folks had, but without input from a lot of the Native American cultures that are still around today, we wouldn't know anywhere near as much as we think we do. So
Right. Yeah.
it's great having their input and being able to ask them what certain things mean.
Yeah, it's cool to have that combination of the archaeology and then also the history that's passed down from generation to generation. Well,
Absolutely.
I guess we will wrap it up. Randy says, "Great job, Matt." So, so
Thanks,
thank
Randy.
you, thank you for taking us through some of those mounds, and we'll have to continue our journey through the Mound Trail as we do these.
Take advantage of the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail as soon as you can get out.
Yeah, let's see. I can pop up the website here for anybody who is interested in checking it out. Well, I think that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. We'll be doing this every weekday, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. every morning. And each day will feature a different aspect of UA museums. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about natural history with the Alabama Museum of Natural History on their Facebook page at 10 a.m. So come join them over there. And for a full live stream schedule and links to our Color Our Collections coloring book and Discovering Alabama's online educational resources, including their free episodes and teacher guides, which also features the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail. They have an episode of Discovering Alabama on it that does have a teacher guide, so you can go check that out. You can get all those links to all those resources at museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. And thank you, everybody, for visiting UA Museums from your home. Hope everybody has a great day.
Everybody. See you next time.